long-range planning, handling the Air Force component of Vietnamization. All these things give him a great deal of knowledge and expertise about not only how to implement policy and carry it through, but also the kind of people you need and how to get their cooperation, how to get their buy-ins. And this is how you did it, as well as through the community system that, again, you heard of earlier. So 4, going back to even a larger context, is relationships with Congress and the press. Yes, the National Security Advisor you don't want the National Security Advisor speaking to the press directly, but you do want him to be having news conferences on background, of course, communicating with opinion writers, with journalists, with leading people along, and communicating with Congress. This is one of the signal failures of the Vietnam War, is that Congress wasn't included, Congress wasn't brought along, Congress didn't approve the Hanoi peace talks. This was all done really in isolation. And what he learns is that, yes, that Congress, there may not always be the best cast of characters, but you really need to bring them along, have breakfast with them, meet with them, talk with them, consult with them. And again, his work here on the Scowcroft Commission, we work very closely with him and Al Gore and others. Les Aspin showed how successful he was working across the aisle and with the first branch of government. 5th is, I think a legacy of his life is the success of an indirect approach. What I mean by this is one of his characteristic ways of thinking about problems was to think about their underlying causes, and that if you address those, then those problems, or at least their symptoms, dissipate. So rather than belligerently demand that the wall being torn down, for instance, Scowcroft, his NSC staff and administration wanted to create the underlying conditions so the wall wasn't even necessary. So this was working very carefully with the Velvet Revolutions, with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union, to do the sort of things to not threaten the Soviet Union, not have there be a military coup earlier than the one that there was there, not have a revolt by the generals, and to keep this process going. So indirectly leading the condition to the walls to fall down. So having kind of a right set of carrots and sticks to nudge things along. Human rights, too. The cause of human rights is best furthered by making the reasons for political and economic and coercive repression unnecessary. That is, through political and economic development and quiet diplomacy, rather than through exhortations, accusations, and sanctions. The same principle would seemingly apply then to terrorism, that to address the political, economic, and religious conditions that make a particular view of Islam a less viable option and less attractive among Muslim populations. This is in some ways, I would think, a probabilistic approach, that is, making the ground more fertile for constructive politics and less fertile for terrorist or less constructive politics. And this makes sense, in fact, right? That people change and adopt with their nudge when they're cajoled or coaxed, and when being given different options rather than being confronted directly and challenged. 6, and this actually combines the second and third of Mike's talk, Mike's concluding talks, is that what I call Scowcroft's, and he calls himself this, Enlightened Realism. And that he combines both this tough-mindedness and military mindset of the hawk with a willingness to make contacts, make negotiations, and have open communication lines of the dove. He believes that political, economic, and military circumstances can improve. Guided by this enlightened realism, he's been extraordinarily successful then at handling the complex and often hostile world of U.S. foreign relations and national security. And again, whether it's an Air Force officer, advisor to Kissinger, or a business consultant. It's a world then that demands decisive leadership, secrecy, and sometimes violence, the hawk part, but it also calls for long-term horizons and patient adherence to unwavering national goals. And I think this dualism has been a hallmark of Scowcroft's career, this combination of toughness, strong defense, walking softly and carrying a big stick, and also being willing to, again, keep avenues open and agree to multilateral agreements. And again, as Mike suggested, this nuanced view doesn't really conform well to the simplicities of American retail politics or of some strands of the more idealistic and reformist aspects of U.S. internationalism, which then gets to the importance of optics, how politics are framed and presented, and outreach, strategic communications, and so forth, which takes me back to the points about the press. Where classical realism assumes that international relations is a zero-sum game and takes a skeptical attitude towards the possibility of international cooperation, Scowcroft sees U.S. strategic interests as allowing for positive sum exchanges, win-win situations among states. Savvy politicians are able to look beyond the nation's immediate security and need to see how they can work with other governments, international organizations, and other institutions to advance the well-being of the United States and other actors, other states, in conjunction. And so pursuit of goals in coordination of a well-functioning international economy, prevention of pandemics, protection of the environment, control of security against member states, and a lot of these solutions are only possible through collective action. This is to say that Scowcroft believes in global public goods, although that's not a term he uses. Examples, though, of other global public goods are those obtained through the international agreements that the United Nations has made on telecommunications, postal service, medicine, meteorology, marine navigation, civil aviation, and other areas. And you can again think of climate change, nuclear proliferation, or early tsunami warnings, for all that matter, among others of this class. 7, I think Scowcroft has something to tell us about government secrecy and accountability. Ironically, which is ironic given his famous reserve and, in fact, secrecy. When I asked the general about Edward Snowden's leaks, he said he was against Snowden's revelations, quote, with every fiber of his body. This was in accord with my expectations and consistent with Scowcroft's longtime support for executive privilege, presidential discretion, and strong U.S. intelligence capabilities. In the very next breath, though, he surprised me by saying that Snowden's leaks might have a salutary effect by starting a constructive debate among members of Congress, the press, and the public about legislative oversight, the quality and scale of government operations, and democratic accountability. And by the way, both Snowden and CIA torturers discussed in the Senate report of last year were contractors, a fact that has received little attention thus far. Scowcroft's lesson, and I'm probably overstating here a bit, would be that the use of torture, the too ready recourse to drones, domestic spying, detract from U.S. soft power and the legitimacy of the U.S. government in a world of states. So when U.S. presidents cannot claim that the United States seek to protect human rights and cannot point out to other countries of the United States being an example of a shining city on a hill as the leader of the free world in a post-Cold War world, then it's harder for the United States to lead, or for that matter, for American citizens to trust their government. 8, even though Scowcroft is as hard-nosed as anyone, he also believes the United States and its promise for the world, as I've just suggested. In this sense, he is less aggressive than most realists, and you see this with the Mayaguez incident and his reaction to the Korean tree incident, which I'll talk about shortly. Actually, I don't talk about it, and it's a axe murder on the DMZ zone, which almost comes to a very violent end, but doesn't. I think this is stepping back. I think it's fair to say that there's a moral dimension to national security. Then, even if it's used cynically and hypocritically at times, that doesn't mean it's unimportant or non-trivial symbolically. And this now seems to be missing. It was there for the United States during the World War II, during the Cold War, and arguably in the first Gulf War. Such moral certitude did not spare presidents from having to make extremely tough decisions. Think of the Korean War, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Helsinki Final Act. But the overall objective was clear. As a result, one of the legacies of Scowcroft is of asking us sort of where the post-Cold War moral vision is, and how does it fit in the United States' grand strategy? So what replaces the containment of the Soviet Union? What is the United States for? How is U.S. diplomacy, foreign trade and investment, and military force harnessed? Is it just against terrorism, ISIS, extremism, or other groups? Is it just is it justice is it just for the benefit of American companies? What promise does the United States offer to our children and grandchildren and other people of the world? Certainly not for the Syrian refugees, it seems. Many have weighed in on these questions, to be sure, but I would argue that there really has been no consensus or persuasive case made since President Bush, Brent Scowcroft, James Baker, weighed in at the end of the Cold War. And perhaps this is because things are so much messier and more complex now, even if not necessarily more serious or more endangering to the United States. 9, and many people have touched on this, and this is as a person, his selflessness to the country, his colleagues, his clients, his fellow commissioners, or others. It wasn't about himself. He's really been exemplary of such selflessness, and in a way that was true to himself. Duty, honor, country, indeed. And a true kindness, a considerate and charitable man. He was, if I've met anybody who lived up to the adage, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all, it was him. Now, to friends and to a couple of times to me, and you see in the record, there were some asides and there's some comments and there were digs. So it's not that he's a saint, but in generally he's just very charitable, very generous, and preferred to look beyond any immediate dispute and didn't take those personally. And last is a strategist. I've been criticized for overusing that term, and that he's really, he's more like a fixer or a bureaucrat or a tactician. And I don't think that's true. And let me give a few examples of his strategic thinking. That is the ability to keep the big picture in mind, or to see the big picture and to work with the pieces in play to be operationally effective and to achieve results. So when the British pound was collapsing in 1976, with Secretary of State Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon at loggerheads, Scowcroft stepped in and quietly worked out an arrangement for concessions to the Prime Minister Callaghan's Labour government and for a $4 billion IMF package to bail out Great Britain, and which had to have the support of Germany and France. And by the way, that was about $16 billion today. The key was, though, with the pound plummeting on the world markets, any publicity would provoke a further run on the pound. All the negotiations had to be kept secret then, away from the press, lest there be more speculation. And there were, and so they had to be kept away from the press, and it was kept away from the press, which bespeaks, given the salience of the issue, about just the trust that others had in him and the processes he set up, notwithstanding the financial stakes, the political disagreements, and ideological agreements between Callaghan's Labour government and the free market economists in the U.S. Treasury Department, as well as many others in the Ford administration. A second example of this strategic vision is, and ability as a strategist, is Scowcroft's advice to President Bush in early 1989 that the United States and the Soviet Union both withdraw their ground forces from Central Europe. His logic was that NATO minus the U.S. in comparison to the Warsaw Pact minus the USSR would clearly be the United States' net advantage, and would take the initiative away from Mikhail Gorbachev, who of course was getting a great deal of press and acclaim at the time. Although the idea provoked a firestorm in the administration, especially from defense, the president agreed to a scaled-back version of Scowcroft's idea. A third was Scowcroft's decision later under Bush 41, when he previously proposed as chair of the Scowcroft Commission to push for a radical reduction in the number of MIRV warheads and the adaptation of single warhead ICBMs, a process called downloading in the nuclear weapons lexicon. Scowcroft's argument, and one that gradually would prevail, was that MIRV rockets with up to 10 warheads were both more attractive as targets and as weapons to be used than were single warhead ICBMs. This, in fact, was the logic of reducing the number and lethality of strategic weapons that infused both START and START-2. So that, in conclusion, this ability to look above the political fray, not to worry about the equities departments and agencies had in existing problems, and not to take politics as first and foremost, and not to worry about losing out, are what made him extraordinary. Yes, he is an insider par excellence, and yet the irony, or maybe perhaps because of this, he has been able to speak truth to power. His reaction about how the U.S. should respond to 9/11, and then for the Democrats and others, his decisions to support the surge are cases in point where he ran against the intellectual currents of the time or his supposed allies. Again, I think it's fair to say the legacy is yet to be formed because he's not yet a household name, but I think such a legacy can only help the United States and American policymakers and the country in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. So a couple of questions, and then I'd like to open this discussion up to all of you. Mike, this is a session on Scowcroft's legacy. And is his legacy as a realist to be out of step with the American commitment to liberalism, and therefore likely to be swept over as we march forward in our dominant motif of?
I think his legacy is going to be like former President or 41's legacy. It'll be like a fine wine. It'll get better and better with time. And that precisely because some of the positions he took, and I would think about particularly the decision to go to China so soon after Tiananmen, which was wildly unpopular on both the left and the right. In retrospect, I think made good sense because what were we going to do? We're going to have a major diplomatic crisis about a domestic development in China. And would it have made any positive difference in the human rights situation in China over the longer term? And I'm convinced that the answer to both of those is no. And so those sorts of things will become apparent over time. And his approach, which I think is guided by a different way of looking at the world than most Americans have, will be recognized as a factor in those decisions.
How would you respond to the proposition that the realist perspective that both he and Bob Gates adhered to made them and President Bush extremely skeptical about Gorbachev? And therefore they delayed. Whereas Gorbachev had made this initiative with Reagan, made this major speech at the United Nations saying the Cold War is over, and the Bush administration and the skepticism on the part of Scowcroft and Gates is very substantial. And consequently, by the time of Malta, opposition to Gorbachev had already peaked domestically. I mean, he was beginning to have real trouble. And so we missed, by their skepticism, by their Cold War realism, the opportunity to make a different kind of outcome.
Well, we're in the world of counterfactual history, which
Sure.
Is always difficult to settle. But my sort of view of their handling of the end game of the Cold War is, on some issues they weren't 100% right, and their skepticism about Gorbachev's intentions, I would be fully willing to concede they didn't get right. But on the other hand, on the big issues, and particularly the negotiation of German reunification, and I'd like to think that a decision the second Bush 41 administration would not have made would have been expansion of NATO, which of course the Clinton administration was happy to do, and the Bush 43 administration embraced as well. I think if you ask me why did Russian-U.S. relations go south, it had very little to do with the fact that we weren't as effusive in our embrace of Gorbachev as maybe as we should have been, and more a function of the fact that the Russians thought that the end of the Cold War meant one thing, and that what they got by the middle of the 1990s was the realization that NATO was going to keep coming closer and closer to Russia. So that's my counterfactual history.
Let me chime in on that point, because I think it very much informed them the realism about their reaction to this, to the Gorbachev's overtures, because they'd lived through detente, right? The promise of detente, and then realizing that it didn't work. There was kind of this glass Foxborough, New Jersey, a period of softening, and they were very skeptical. I mean, they were sort of the realists, just as you heard. It's the realists is about, you know, their material forces and their material resources. And the Soviet Union at the time, I mean, Gorbachev has made these speeches, but there are still those 20,000 nuclear weapons. There's still the hundreds of thousands of troops in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and there were still aid to Afghanistan and El Salvador and Cambodia. And so they hadn't renounced communism or the revolution of the workers around the world. And so there's all sorts of reasons to believe that Gorbachev, yes, he had wanted to have perestroika and glasnost, but was this really just to make the Soviet Union a more viable state? Was this, in fact, really because he was changing communism per se and the permanent integration of the Soviet Union in the world of states? And I think they're quite right to say, well, look, show us the money. We'll judge by empirics. The irony is that Ambassador Jack Matlock is writing very early in the administration from Moscow and diagnosing the situation exactly right. But they didn't know it, and they had to work Gorbachev through and the administration through to get to that place, and all sorts of things could have gone wrong, as you know, and there was, and this thing still had to, as I said, they had to get these troops out to disarm and to stop these aid programs and find a way to end this peacefully. So I think they were right to be skeptical.
Bert, let me ask you, here's this important work we've already referred to. How did you come to decide the title of this book in terms of thinking about the legacy of Brent Scowcroft, to call it The Strategist?
Well, it's funny. I was interested in writing about Scowcroft as a way of talking about the organization of the NSC process and writing about how U.S. foreign policy evolved from the Cold War to the current situation. And I thought Scowcroft would be a wonderful lens by which to talk about that. And I was aware, of course, of his Wall Street Journal editorial, him being twice National Security Advisor. And then there was this peculiar thing where he comes out in support of the surge after earlier opposing the war. And I thought, this is a really very interesting guy. And I was thinking, because not that many people had seen him as a strategist, and because so many people, I mean, as you heard from Stephen Hadley this morning, that the National Security Advisor, all the credit goes to the president, all the problems or issues are the fault of the National Security Advisor. Well, if you really look down, you realize that a lot of these policies were done in conjunction with Scowcroft and the president, and to think of them as having no vision, when you think about how they ended the Cold War, the expansion of markets, of NAFTA, dealing with China, again, the demise of the Soviet Union, I think that's really quite unfair. And so thinking about a sort of a title that would capture kind of this maybe unexpected element of Scowcroft, given how quiet he'd been and how he'd been called, Neil Sheehan calls him a sort of a typical staff officer, writing him on John Paul Van. And so,
When I came over back here after our noon break, I was startled to see a workman in goggles with a blowtorch applying the blowtorch to the statue of President Bush. I don't know how that looks to him up from his balcony, but I'm interpreting this literally as it's a responsibility of you to light a fire under this panel with your questions here as we bring this part of our session to a close. Questions? We have a microphone here. I invite you to.
Since no one's asking a question, I ask questions just to